Good evening, everybody. Let's start. We already have the academic 15 minutes, then you can start. Well, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce you to Professor Robert Guttmann. Those who are from Campinas probably met already Guttmann, or at least read some of his books and articles. He was telling me that he is in touch with this university since 1993 or 4, right? Yes. When he firstly met Luciano Coutinho, who is a former professor here, a very important professor to this institute, and he is also former president of the Brazilian Development Bank, and then he was the first person Robert met in Europe, and then since then he's coming here every 2 or 3 years, right?
Yes.
But still, every time it's a great honor for us to have you here, even because you are always having new things to tell us. And Robert has a very important book by 1994. How credit money shapes economy, but then recently he has published 2 other very interesting books, Finance-Led Capitalism in 2016, if I'm not wrong, and then last year, Eco-Capitalism. And now he's working in his 3rd book of this sequence, which is precisely multipolar capitalism. So it is like an avant-premiere of the ideas that he's developing in this book. So Robert, thank you very much for being here with us.
Hi, is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. So let me first thank the organizers of this winter school, in particular Bruno, who happened to be also a former student of mine in Paris 13. As he mentioned, I've been working recently on a trilogy on capitalism, and this came about from a long-term interest in the historic evolution of capitalist economies. I didn't really get to it until the crisis hit. I was more interested and also immediately demanded to work on monetary theory and on finance, and I had to teach a lot of finance. And eventually, you turn about 60 years old, which happened just in the context of the crisis, and I said to myself, now or never. And then I kind of began to think that what I needed to do was to understand that we're in a transition and hopefully understand as much as possible how this transition may unfold, right? And the transition that I'm particularly referring to here is embodied in a kind of theoretical framework that I've been interested in and following since I was a 2nd-year undergraduate student in Vienna, which is long waves. So one of my interests is to think in terms of long waves, and I'll talk more about it, so I'll give you some idea what that means and how I fit into that, right? But part of what long waves is about is to look at a long-term view of capitalist evolution, and in my particular framework, which is a framework that is the reason why I have been working for the last 26 years in Paris 13. It's a French approach called regulation school. So I'm part of that framework, right? And regulationists think in terms of accumulation regimes to explain long waves, right? So you have distinct phases of capitalist development in accumulation regimes, and then they basically fall apart, they disintegrate. And that's typically the downswing phase of a long wave. You have crisis, you have particular features that we see very clearly establishing themselves now. And then you have at the beginning of the downswing, when you go from the upswing to the downswing, you have a systemic, typically a crisis of systemic proportions. And then you have a second crisis. We're not yet there. And it is the second crisis that typically forces the reorganization of the accumulation regime. The first one weakens it and undermines it and basically disintegrates it. And then in that process of disintegration, you get into a second crisis, which typically then forces a new accumulation regime. Right? The second crisis can be a war, like World War II was clearly the second crisis of an accumulation regime change, or it could be a depression, or it could be, I mean, there's different types of crisis, right? We'll talk more about that later, right? So my idea was that we had a regime, finance-led capitalism. I'll talk about this in the first part of my talk. And then that finance-led capitalism had its crisis, which was the 2007-2009 crisis. I will explain to you that this is not just 2007-2009, but as it globally propagated itself, it actually went all the way till 2015, and that Brazil and China are clearly to be understood precisely in that context of the slow motion propagation of this crisis. We're now kind of in an interim period, but my hypothesis is the next crisis, the one that reorganizes the accumulation regime. I don't want to sound too mechanical, it's not mechanical, but there are patterns, right? That next crisis is going to be the ecological crisis, right? It's going to be the climate change crisis. And that climate change crisis is going to be a crisis of very radical proportions. Right? And so I wrote then the second book, which was projecting forward what could happen in that crisis and how you would get a kind of an ecologically grounded capitalism, which seems to be a contradiction in terms, but that's the fascinating part. So I wrote this book, Eco-Capitalism, and the subtitle of that is Carbon Money, Climate Finance, and Sustainable Development. So to me, the only way in which you can have a kind of an ecologically grounded capitalism is with a very different type of money and a very different type of finance. Right? But now what I'm interested in is precisely the transition, how we get from finance-led capitalism to the climate crisis and then beyond, right? And the transition that we're in is a kind of a disintegration process that establishes a kind of a multipolarity, right? So we're going away from the US dominance into a multipolar configuration, which is much more complicated to manage, obviously. And so the book that I'm working on right now, which I hope to have done by next year, is Multipolar Capitalism, the End of the Dollar Standard. So, what I want to start first is to explain to you a bit more about finance-led capitalism, because if we want to figure out where we are and where we're going, we really have to also understand where we came from. The important part of it is also to explain that one of the driving forces of this process is finance, and is in particular the international monetary system, right? So I'm want to nail that into your heads very, very early so that you can see this as a thread unfolding in the argument, right? So we had a previous type of accumulation regime that we generally refer to as Fordism, which came out of World War II. Reforms made right after World War II, actually even beforehand with Bretton Woods in 1944, and preceding that actually a model of reforms in the New Deal of Roosevelt in the wake of the Great Depression. And Fordism was based on rapid industrialization, based on mass production technologies with social consumption norms like deriving from ownership, cars, consumer electronics, and so forth, right? You get it into a crisis, right? A stagflation crisis, an unprecedented crisis. We've never had stagflation crisis like that before. This was the topic of my earlier book that he referred to, How Credit Money Shapes the Economy. We have not a depression, but stagflation, because we have a very different type of money and a very different type of financial system coming out of the New Deal. And so we're preventing depression, which was the typical type of structural crisis, and we have a different one, a slower, more moderate crisis, but the one that still is devastating in many ways. Two things happen in that crisis. One is that you get the breakdown of a regulatory structure for money and banking. Right? The stagflation crisis destroys what was put in place during the New Deal and then in the rest of the world after World War II. So this gets usually crystallized around the breakdown of Bretton Woods in 1971, but it is a far deeper process, right? So what comes out of it is systematic, progressive deregulation of money and banking. Right? And that gets forced by the crisis. For example, when you have a system, when you have interest rates capped, you have ceilings on interest rates, and inflation rates go above the interest rates that are capped, and the caps are not adjusted upwards, which they were not because it was politically too sensitive, then you get basically a creditor strike. Yeah. You have negative interest rates, and then the banks don't want to lend at negative interest rates, right? So automatically, every time in the US, whenever inflation rates pushed above the interest rate ceilings established by the Fed under Regulation Q, the whole credit system just shut down, and you get sequences of credit crunches. And eventually, each credit crunch gets worse, 1966, 69, 70, 73, 4, 5, and then the really bad ones, 79 onwards, right? They suffocate the system, and so you eventually going to deregulate interest rates, which happened in 1979. So this is just an illustration of a very complex process by which a particular crisis destroyed a particular institutional regulatory regime that was put into place in the 1930s and 40s to deal with money and banking. You get the successive deregulation of money and banking. Right? Starts with exchange rates in 1973, capital controls in 1974, the emergence of money markets on a big scale, which is a whole new feature of finance in 1975. Then you get an important meeting, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, called the Kingston Agreement, which establishes new rules of the game for the international monetary system. That's what I call the dollar standard. Then you get interest rates being deregulated in 1979, and subsequently you get the integration of the hitherto separated functions of finance under one roof. Before that, in the earlier regime, Fordism, investment banking, commercial banking, insurance, fund management, all of that was separated by structural regulations. They were like walls. Think of this like a zoo with cages. And in the process of the 80s and 90s, all of this was removed, and the cages were gone, and you could integrate finance under universal banking. Okay? And that was legally, that process happened before it was legally ratified, first in Europe with the second banking directive of 1989, subsequently in the US with the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999. So you get universal banking. Okay? In that process, finance becomes dominant, right? And it becomes global. Because what was crucial in that process is that starting in 1960, remember in 1960, I don't know if you were not around, but in 1960 you get an important change in the way Bretton Woods works, right? Because you're going from a dollar shortage to a dollar surplus, an excess amount of dollars in the world. And you also get the convertibility of currencies, which previously were restricted in how you could exchange, right? So within a year of that happening, banks in London decided that they would be willing and able to actually set up a system where they would have dollar-denominated deposits and dollar-denominated loans in London, outside of the US. So you get a system, you get from this on, this is now known as euro currencies or the euro market, but it has nothing to do with the euro, don't confuse that. And you get a global banking system, right, that sets itself up parallel to the domestically controlled and regulated banking systems all over the world. So you get a parallel banking system, right, starting in 1960, which is known as the euro currency system, and then later just the euro banking or whatever, right? Today it's called offshore banking, but that's a very narrow view of this, right? So since 1960, every country had two parallel banking systems, right? And the global one was not regulated. It later became regulated with Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, and we can talk about that, right? But it was not regulated. And it was the thing that undermined all the regulatory systems, right, in place for domestic banking. because banks could easily, with what we call regulatory arbitrage, move out of their regulated system into the unregulated global system. Right? That's one thing. The second thing is that this system, which is global, it's called euro, but it was because it was for a while just mostly concentrated in London, but then it became global. Now it's in Dubai, and it's maybe in Johannesburg, but it has a number of financial centers all over the world. It's a global system. There's two times as many dollars in that system as inside of the US. That system is the vector of globalization. Right? And you have to understand that globalization started with this process. It was financial globalization. Financial globalization drives other processes of globalization because capital in the form of money is extremely mobile and fast, right? You get a technological infrastructure that moves funds very rapidly, right? So you get in that sense the dominance of finance, right? Because now you have a global system of money transfers. Of course, this allows tax evasion. This allows money laundering on a massive scale. This makes it very easy to establish global value chains, and the more you decentralize production, the more you're going to concentrate cash flows as a matter of control, and so forth, right? You have to understand that everything that happened was facilitated and ratified and organized by this system. Okay? Right. So of course there is details, right? For example, that system organized petrodollar recycling in the 70s. Then when the US deregulated interest rates and they tripled in 3 weeks in 1979, that created a double whammy for 56 countries that found themselves in default, right? Including Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, all on the same bloody day, the 20th of August of 1982. And so you get this crisis, the LDC debt crisis. There was already reference being made earlier by André. And out of that crisis comes how shall I put this, right? The moving of 1.5 or 2 billion people, and then with the collapse of communism, another 1 billion people, into the global capitalist system. The crisis was resolved by basically taking those debts, which were loans, and turning them into bonds, Brady bonds, and then turning them into sovereign bonds, so that all these countries were tied forever, it seems, into now a new type of global sovereign bond market. And hence, we're tied into this system that I was referring to before, the euro currency system, right? So you're getting out of a crisis a much higher level of global integration via financial flows. You also have to understand that two other things happen at the same time. One is that out of this deflation crisis came a response to the prevailing ideological mainstream consensus that was national Keynesianism, right? Which was, the Keynesian revolution, 1930s. Fordism is very much a Keynesian policy prescription and so forth. And then you have a conservative counter-revolution. And I arrived in the US during that conservative counter-revolution. And it was not just that some people just said, let's take power. It usually comes in an intense crisis, right? So during the Carter years in the late 70s, the Keynesian idea of being counter-cyclical macroeconomic stabilization policy became very confusing because you have simultaneous increases in inflation and unemployment, and the Keynesian policy mix was set up to fight either one or the other. And as it was trying to fight one or the other, it was zigzagging, and therefore it made the stagflation crisis worse because it created expectations or very confused sets of expectations. And so Carter, who was a very, beautifully smart person, a morally very upright guy, was a policy disaster because in his 4 years that he was in power, he changed macroeconomic stabilization policies 4 times. Right? And the Reagan Revolution already prepared for in advance by Thatcher in Great Britain, and Britain and the US are very important in all the story, ever since they fought it out during the interwar period. And I think they will also be important in the drama of Trump and Brexit to come, which will be dramatic. Britain set the stage. You get the counter-revolution, but the counter-revolution Reagan was quite profound. Okay? It's a different policy regime. And it also has a very, very vivacious vision for policy making across the world, right? Known as the Washington Consensus. So when all these other countries are in crisis, LDC debt crisis, 56 countries in de facto default, they're also vulnerable to trying something new, imposed by a troika of the US Treasury, the World Bank, and above all, the international lender of the last resort, which is the IMF. So you get a huge policy shift taking root in the early, in the late 80s. It becomes a global phenomenon. The second thing that happens, and this is relevant for what's going to happen relatively soon in that transition. In one of the American bubbles that I'll talk about later, the first real important bubble, which is in the 80s and is known as the bubble of the corporate raiders, the raiders were fought off by large corporations by promising the institutional investors that were shareholders not to go with the raiders but go with them under the promise that shareholder value maximization would become the dominant paradigm of corporate governance. And this then leads subsequently to all kinds of things, right? Share buybacks, paying managers with stock options, firing workers to boost your stock price, all kinds of things. But above all, it becomes also a matter of short-termism and not thinking about other stakeholders, right? One of my arguments will be that if the US is not able to change this subsequently soon, it will fall behind gravely, because the new paradigm of corporations will be different. But in terms of understanding finance-led capitalism, you have to understand that it's not just a financialization process in terms of increased assets and liabilities on the balance sheets of non-financial actors, even including households. And it's not just the growing size of finance, but it is also this idea that corporations organize themselves around nothing but shareholder value maximization, keeping the value of shares as high as possible and making this the #1 goal. The final important part in this slide is that when you have this finance-led capitalism and it has organized itself around a refurbished dollar standard, which takes the place of the collapsed Bretton Woods system, then the dollar was under attack in the 70s. In the wake of this deflation crisis, it revives itself. First by jacking up interest rates in 79, and then killing inflation in that process. And then Reaganomics is really important, right? Because it gives the US a massive fiscal boost with redistribution effects that also have momentarily stimulative impacts. So the Reaganomics, in particular in 1981, but then a stabilization of that in excess in 1986. So this was a very successful presidency ultimately. Not from my point of view politically, but from the point of view of reorganizing American capitalism, get a new type of policy mix in place that had a bipartisan consensus, and then boosting the US out of its foxhole again. And the way the US boosted itself out of that foxhole, out of that stagflation crisis, with low inflation rates, was through a new deal, a global deal that's at the heart of finance-led capitalism. And this deal is that you have to understand this, right? It's kind of essential to the story, right? So when you have a currency like the dollar being world money, primarily the international medium of exchange, it has to be transferred out of the country of issue to the rest of the world. Are we okay with that? Because it's not created in Brazil, and it's not created in Britain, it's created within the US banking system. And the US banking system, including government and central bank. It has to be transferred out of the US to get into international circulation. The way it gets transferred out is by the US running balance of payments deficits, right? Balance of payments is the balance between inflows and outflows. When you run deficits, you get a net outflow. So the US has to run balance of payments deficits. It's the only country that has to do that. That's how it supplies international currency. Right? The advantage of that system, of course, is that the rest of the world automatically finances those deficits. Right? Just by holding dollars, either as reserves or using them as medium of exchange for payments between themselves, they automatically absorb that outflow and therefore automatically basically finance. Right? So the US, for example, the US has reserves less than Luxembourg. It doesn't need reserves. So it's in this privileged position. And until then, so let's say in the gold standard of the late 19th century, which was actually run by Britain, but then later with Bretton Woods, run by dollars, the exports of dollars came through capital exports. In this new system, the dollar standard that I'm referring to here, the outflow of dollars, in other words, the US balance of payments deficit is basically driven by US trade deficits. And so the Americans become the buyers of last resort for the rest of the world. And this goes in a very beautiful way, more and more intense through the 90s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, right? You basically have, the US has basically a debt-driven bubble economy, a debt-driven economy of asset bubbles. The asset bubbles allow the Americans to spend more and more than they're making in income. Because also one effect, for example, of the bubbles is that in the US, under Reaganomics, capital gains got to be taxed much less than everything else, right? And the access to debt to finance asset purchases for speculative purposes was made much easier. And so you literally create, by a variety of policy measures, a speculation-driven bubble economy. All right? And each bubble is broader and deeper and wider and crazier than the preceding one. So you get three bubbles. In the final bubble, homeowners, American homeowners, right? You have, you have these three bubbles, right? Raiders in the 80s, the dot-com bubble, which ultimately gave us the internet as a vector of e-commerce in the late 90s, and then the housing bubble in the 2000s. What then becomes the subprime crisis. Right? The key here is to understand that it's the bubbles that drive the excess spending of the US. Right? Because when I say balance of payments deficit needed to have the dollars flow out, underneath this is a process of excess spending. Okay? So the US, by the time we get to the crisis of 2007, the US spends $107.8 for every $100 that it generates in income. At that point, the US has a negative savings rate of 2%. It's the richest country in the world, and it has a negative savings rate. Think of the macroeconomic twisting of this kind of bubble economy. You know? It's not sustainable, obviously. But here's the important issue, right? Those twin deficits, the US has a large budget deficit, it has a growing current account deficit. So we're talking about twin deficits, right? Those twin deficits drive the rest of the world under the dollar standard. There is a matching, there's there's a matching between export-led growth by the rest of the world and US deficits. By 2007, when the crisis hits, the US current account deficit, which at that point is 7.8% of GDP, is between 2/3 and 3/4, depending how you measure it, of the current account surpluses of the rest of the world. So the US is basically absorbing export-led growth strategies of both industrial countries like Japan and Germany, or emerging market economies like, quote unquote, China. Right? And this is a pattern. This is like an iron embrace. Yeah. They both need each other, right? The surpluses of China, the surpluses of Germany, and so forth, get automatically recycled to the US. It's as if you have a drug dealer giving the drug-dependent person constant money, buy my drugs, right? And that's a pattern, right? What's essential about this pattern is that you have the ability in this pattern if it goes over 25 years, you have the successful ability of integrating 3 billion people for the first time into the world economy. You have this huge demographic shift, right? You all being here are total proof of that, right? Who in the 1980s would have thought about a BRICS winter school in tropical Brazil, right? Where the only people from the not from the previously excluded world in those terms are 2 German students. This is important, right? This is important. But part of this process, of course, also means an explosion in greenhouse gas emissions, which now we're going to pay for. Right? I'll get to that in a moment later. I probably have to speed up this process here, right? So you get the global systemic crisis. And that global systemic crisis motivated my finance-led capitalism book, right? You have a systemic crisis. I mean, we have to understand what a systemic crisis is, right? Part of what I'm interested in is different levels of crisis, different natures of crisis, right? I'm interested in that. A systemic crisis, above all, is a crisis that engulfs the entire financial system, right? It's not just the crisis of a few banks. Okay? We're talking about a crisis that engulfs the entire financial system. We have those crises seemingly every 60, 70 years. 1873, 1929, then we can say that 1971 to 73, and then 2007, 8, 9, and so on. Right? So in a way, such crises are interesting, right? They don't happen very often, but they certainly define the rest of your life. I remember my parents talking about the Great Depression, right? I'm remembering that when I'm going to die, my kids are going to talk to me about 2007, 2008, right? Or my grandchildren, I don't know. Anyway. But a systemic crisis is also important because in the long wave context, which is going to be my next slide, they mark a turning point. Right? And they're important in the sense that they propagate, they disturb, they shake. It's like a slow motion earthquake. Right? So what I want to make sure that we get is that there's 3 transmission channels by which this momentary explosion of financial instability becomes a great crisis. In many ways, by many measures, this was the greatest financial crisis ever. Right? And part of this has to do with the fact that you have huge losses, entire parts of the financial system collapse and have not yet revived. Right? So you have huge losses, and you have huge losses of banks across the world because in this recycling mechanism that I described to you before, where excess dollars from abroad have to go back to the US so that the US can sustain its overspending, more and more of those banks outside or other financial institutions outside chose to give money to AAA mortgage-backed securities rather than to US Treasury securities or corporate bonds, right? So they fed this machine, this incredible machine that created this housing bubble. Right? They fed this machine of mortgages, refinancings, and you have to understand that in the US you have a mortgage, and then housing prices go up, and then the bank calls you and says, would you like to have $200,000 tomorrow in your pockets? This is as we go into this crazy bubble, right? And the way it's done, you go to the bank, 20 minutes later, they have refinanced your mortgage at a higher principal in matching the increase in the value of your house. So you basically can take your house as an ATM machine to draw cash from. If you can do that, you're going to spend a lot, you're not going to save, right? And you're basically putting all of your eggs into maintaining the increase of housing prices, right? And at some point that's not gonna work, right? But people leave themselves incredibly vulnerable. Now what feeds this machine is that you have a global supply of excess dollars circulating abroad that have to go back to the US. And as long as these mortgage-backed securities are AAA, why not give it to them if you get 4.8% and not put it in a treasury bond that gives you 3.2%? It's all AAA, right? And that's what we had, right? But when this collapses, it leads to huge losses for banks across the world. You had 24 countries requiring very expensive bank bailouts. The bank bailouts in the European Union alone were $437 billion that year. Of course, one of the things that's problematic about this politically is that if you bail out those who create the crisis and they come home free and you are suffering from that crisis, you're going to be pretty pissed off. So this was also an earthquake for anger, okay? The anger is there, and the anger is there that ultimately leads to voting for Trump and voting for Bolsonaro and voting for Urban and voting for who knows who. Right? There's anger. You get to identify leads as those that are shitting on you. Right? And that's not very good for the political stability of a country, or any country. You also have the end of this US-driven, consumer-led, export-led growth pattern, right? So the US, basically what a crisis does is it forces countries to shift their sectoral balances between private sector, public sector, external sector, right? You can do this with policy, you can do this with, with changing expectations, and if you don't do it the right way at the right time, then it's going to be a crisis that does it for you, right? And so crises have this kind of rebalancing role, and so the US basically was forced, like Brazil today, it has no external deficit and low inflation, but because of a crisis, right? Crisis adjusts you. You'll see this in your personal life, right? I smoked for 41 years until my doctor told me, you want to die in 5 years and it's going to be very painful to get to that point, or you're going to stop smoking. I stopped smoking the same day. Then I gained a lot of weight, but that's a different story, right? You change one problem with another problem. We always do. So, the economy is just human, right? It's just a bunch of humans trying to figure out relationships, right? So it's pretty well understood that once you have the US as the buyer of the last resort disappear, there's going to be a massively lower aggregate demand level for most other countries. And once you have severely impaired banks, they're going to be like not carrying the economy as well. So we have damaged economies, right? With excess capacities worldwide. The excess capacities are really important because they will explain what's happening now as we go forward. But the third mechanism is not so well understood, even though I think the Brazilians understood it better than most and earlier than most, because when I was here in 2010, I already had Guido Manchega saying we have a currency war. Right? So there's this process, right, of propagation, where it's like the crisis feeds itself through currency fluctuations to other countries. So the response is, the system was that when you have a global systemic crisis, this is another characteristic of a global systemic crisis, it triggers a debt deflation spiral. The greatest American economists of the 20th century identified this and analyzed this in 1933, known as Irving Fisher. You get a debt deflation spiral. It is exactly then when you get a depression. The necessary but not sufficient condition of being in a depression is a debt deflation spiral. And so you want to desperately avoid that, right? And you want to avoid this with fiscal stimulus. You had both Bush with TARP, which is $787 billion, and then the stimulus, no, $700 billion, sorry, and then a few months later, Obama with a stimulus package of $787 billion. So they pumped $1.5 trillion into the economy within 6 months, right? So you have that process where you want to desperately avoid a debt deflation spiral. And the key is not just fiscal stimulus, but the key is also pumping a banking system that's shaking and losing. You're going to have to pump liquidity into that system in excess of the losses, right? You basically have to socialize losses. And so you pump a huge amount of liquidity into the system. You also pump a huge amount of liquidity into the system because people are sitting on liquidity. And the banks are not lending because they're too weak or they're too terrified. And the private economic actors are not borrowing because they have to cut back. They're in a crisis, right? So you get quantitative easing. But quantitative easing has the added impact of lowering your currency, of driving down your currency. It's a surefire way of depreciating your currency. And depreciating currency at this point would stimulate your economy. But when your currency depreciates, another currency appreciates. And they get squeezed. And this is what the currency war was all about, right? That Manchega referred to. So you can see this, you can follow this. I'm doing this, I just finished that part of my book where you could see how this worked, right? So first, the quantitative easing of the dollar, which was a complex set of packages because this is unprecedented. We've never done this before, right? Raised the euro by like 17% in a short period of time, and that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. So then you get a Eurozone crisis, which starts in October 2009. And then by 2012, the Europeans, to get out of this, are starting their quantitative easing. And that quantitative easing then basically explodes the commodity super cycle. So commodity prices go down in 2014 across the board between 20 and 80%, which is not good for Brazil, for example. Brazil has a lot of commodities that it relies on, right? And it slows down China from then on. And China tries to devalue in 2015. It doesn't work. It's a botched devaluation. They don't know how to do this because they have a very strictly, very tightly prescribed regime for the exchange rate, and it's not. So they make a mistake. So you have this third mechanism, right, by which the crisis propagates itself through these currency fluctuations, right? And so this has to be understood properly. Right at the beginning of this crisis, 2007, 2008, the G20 gets upgraded, and in the second meeting of the upgraded G20, they agree not to have protectionism, not to have a trade war. They remember that the trade war in the 30s was a disaster, and even that flirtation of the trade war in the early 70s was bad news. But instead they end up with monetary protectionism. If you forcefully depreciate your currency, it is as if you have an import tariff and an export subsidy on top. Right? So they don't have trade protectionism, they only have that now, because right now the monetary protectionism has exhausted itself. So now you're going to get trade wars. Right? Trump is not an accident. So, yes, but the thing that I wanted to talk about before I get to Trump on the bottom of this slide is that you have this process of slowbalization. Right? The Economist had this article in January that's worth reading. This is an expression by a very interesting Indian person that lives in Amsterdam, Ajej Ajej Bakas, who's a kind of a trend identifier and futurologist, right? And he calls the current process slowbalization. But what you have is a sort of a gradual, but fairly, I mean, I've looked at the data, it's pretty astounding, right? Deglobalization, a retrenchment. Okay? So trade is barely growing at all. Actually, right now in 2019, global volume of trade is falling. Right? For the first time since the crisis, since 2009. You also have a very significant reduction of foreign direct investment, which peaked in 2007 at 5.7% of global GDP, and right now it's 1.7% of global GDP. You have a shortening and regrouping of global value chains. You have a pretty astounding reduction in portfolio investment flows, short-term portfolio investment flows. You can go through a whole set of data about measuring the international activity, cross-border activity in trade, in foreign direct investment, in cross-border merger and acquisitions, in portfolio investments, and in each of these there has been a significant retrenchment, a reduction of activity. And within that overall implosion, slow motion implosion, right, of what used to be globalization, you also have clearly intensifying regionalisation trends. Right? So the Europeans are regrouping their global value chains, and at the heart of changing NAFTA with this new agreement, which may never be ratified, right? The US-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, is to reorganize reorganize value chains especially in car manufacturing, right? So you get that activity where globalization is in reverse. And that puts a lot of pressure on economies that had been organizing themselves around export-led growth. Right? And they need to readjust towards finding domestic pillars of growth. That's the challenge, for example, for China, but a number of other emerging market economies. And that's the challenge within Europe. And that's very, very difficult to do policy-wise, right? So in comes Trump. Trump is like the Joker. And in many ways, he is a joker. I've followed this man for 30 years, right, very close up, so I know a lot about him. Right? And it's kind of terrifying. I wish I didn't. But you are now having a trade war, right? And it's gonna, I mean, as he said, trade wars are good and easy to win, right? I would say they're bad and they're very difficult to win. There's no winner, right? But he also uses the dollar standard to impose financial sanctions, right? I mean, the American presidents, that starts already with Carter, right? But it kind of successively, they realized that the way you really crush somebody's balls is to not let them have access to their dollar accounts, right? That gets everybody. That's a sanction that is really immediate and brutal, right? But of course, it will also make others, and this is very much importantly the case now with Iran. Iran is the key test case for several things, right? And may also be when this famous crisis that I talked to you about is going to start. Other countries are saying, how did we get around the dollar standard? What do we need to set up, right, so as to have a payment system that is no longer dependent on US dollars and the madmen behind those, right? So let me talk a little bit about why this, how I see this, because I do see this in a broader historic context, right? And that context are long waves. Now, I assume that you don't know much about this, or that you know some about it, but you should actually know more about it, because it's fascinating. So, long waves are the statistical child of a Soviet economist called Nikolai Kondratiev, right, who ran the Institute for the Research of Cycles in Moscow in 1925-26, and then paid a high price for saying basically out aloud that capitalism has crisis but then reorganizes itself. Wasn't very popular ultimately with Stalin, and so he lost his job and then later his life. But when he was riding high, he traveled. And so he met he met Keynes, he met a bunch of others. Right, Schumpeter revived him, Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter, when he ran away from the Nazis in Vienna and ended up at Harvard, wrote a famous book in 1939 called Business Cycles. He wrote several famous books. He's one of my favorite economists, not just because he's Austrian. I'm not that nationalistic, but he's good. And in that context of Business Cycles, he revived this idea of Kondratiev waves, right? He recovered him, rediscovered him, right? And Schumpeter himself gave an explanation, which was technological, that technological change happens in clusters, bursts, and then exhaustion. He had a very ambiguous way of looking at this for creative destruction, right? But it should be destructive creation. It's because, yeah, right. There's an S-curve movement of technological change, right? And that was later picked up by Carlota Perez, who has this idea of technological paradigms, also in long waves, right? Then you have the work of another economist whom I love, Hyman Minsky, who has this idea of a financial instability hypothesis, who explains why, I mean, he's a Keynesian, of course, and then maybe a post-Keynesian. He explains the financial instability being endogenous to the capitalist system. It's innate to the capitalist system. But in two crucial contributions at the beginning and at the end of his life, he also had this vision of a long wave, a financial long wave. Right? And the financial long wave is important in the sense that, yes, you're going to get these business cycles, but in fast growth periods, the recessions are short and shallow, and therefore they're not strong enough to recreate discipline and force out the bad debtors and bad creditors. So you don't get the kind of reorganization. Plus, when you have a long period of growth with very small interruptions of short, shallow recessions, people take more and more risks until they get far too over-indebted, right? And so he has this idea of the long waves. Then in the second article, this is in 1964, American Economic Review, right? And then he has another article, 1993, with Paolo Ferri, about long waves and how long waves, the upswing, erodes institutions. So banking regulations, I mean, this is a concrete argument, right? Banking regulations become less and less effective over the long haul in a long growth period. And that also then sets the stage for a major financial crisis. Right? Then you have the industrial reasoning for long waves, which is the long-term tendency of the profit rate to fall. That's a key argument by Marx in volume 3, chapter 13. But he also has in the next chapter counter tendencies. So Marx himself, unlike Marxists, understood that capitalism reorganizes itself. And this idea was picked up by Ernest Mandel. And the first time I got into long waves, I was a 19-year-old very confused cat. Didn't know what to study. And then 2 weeks Mandel came to Vienna and had this workshop on long waves, and it totally blew my mind. Because I was interested in history, I was interested in geography, I was interested in politics, sociology, institutions. This was it. Later on, I tried very hard and I got it, to work this out on my own, and then I've discovered the regulationists in France. They look at long waves in terms of institutional setups. So they have these 5 institutional pillars. This sounds too mechanistic, right? It's actually, when you read them, it's far more impressive, beautiful, and convincing. But for them, you have these 5 institutional pillars that regulate how capitalism works. It's the wage relation, in the broadest sense, which is labor conditions, production conditions, the way workers are organized, the way wages are structured and hierarchized, etc., etc., etc. Then you have competition, again, in the broadest sense of the word, right? Then you have money, and how money gets, what is money, how it works, which is finance by extension. Then you have the state, and then you have international relations. These 5 pillars. And then they show that you have these distinct accumulation regimes, right? Which I kind of briefly list here. Each of these accumulation regimes has a mode of regulation, how it balances itself out, right? So this is an alternative to equilibrium economics, right? This is sort of self-balancing economics by tension. An institutional makeup of management of tensions, right? And then you have something that is very meaningful for me now, especially also in the context of Brazil. You have this world systems theory by Immanuel Wallerstein and Giovanni Arrighi and others, which fits very well with developmentalist theory by Prebisch, Singer, and Celso Furtado. And then you have to understand that there's a, especially in the globalized system we are right now, there's this complex dynamic between the core and the periphery. And that's crucial for how accumulation regimes work, especially going forward. Already in finance-led capitalism, that became crucial with the LDC debt crisis and how we got out of it. But once we get to the transition of low-carbon economy and make this the next accumulation regime, how the rich countries deal with the poorer countries and vice versa is totally, totally, totally crucial. Totally crucial. And this is my eco-capitalism book, by the way. So within this dynamic of long waves, and the argument being now that we are in a transition from one accumulation regime to another, and that requires typically 2 crises. Right? The key that drives this is the so-called international monetary system. And there are not very good works on that. Economists have a hard time figuring out what that is. Okay? Already you have to have a particular type of understanding of finance, or a particular type of vision of money to even think of an international monetary system as something relevant. So this is not a concept that standard economics, works with. Right? But it's very, very important, because when you look at the history of capitalism, going back to the 1840s, when industrialization moves beyond Britain, into Europe, and then later into Japan and America in the late part of the 19th century. When you, in other words, when you start identifying this idea of accumulation regimes, right? Capitalism moves in these long waves through accumulation regimes and their disintegration and their reorganization into new accumulation regime. You realize pretty soon that international monetary system is the vital engine of that. Why? This has to do with the following, right? When you have an international monetary system that works, by international monetary system, I define this as globally accepted forms of international medium of exchange, how countries pay each other, then the exchange rates and exchange rate regimes, there's different ways you can deal with exchange rates, and then the payment system in the broadest sense of the word, which basically has to do with how countries settle each other's payment obligations with each other, right? So this is a particular type of fairly broad definition of what it means to have an international monetary system. I make it consciously broad, right? Because I'm interested in the payment system, the technicalities of the payment system. But for reasons that I'll explain perhaps in response to a question. So I'm encouraging you to ask that question. Now, when an IMS works, right, like Bretton Woods did, or the classic gold standard from 1879 to 1940, right, then it is growth promoting. And it is growth promoting because it moves funds from the center to the periphery and allows the periphery to catch up. Okay? All the three international monetary systems that we had in place before the next one did this, including the dollar standard. Right? The dollar standard, as I told you before, was the US being the buyer of last resort, running very large trade deficits. Right? Those trade deficits pumped money into the rest of the world. Okay? So in the international monetary system, what it does, on a global scale, it allows a growth-promoting relationship between the center, the core, if you will, and the periphery. The periphery can be just Canada next door. Okay? The periphery is not below, right? It's just spatially. However, to the degree that the periphery catches up, it creates a crisis. So any international monetary system becomes a victim of its own success. Okay? It catches up, I mean the other countries catch up, then you have overproduction crisis. The other countries catch up, then existing exchange rate regimes become obsolete. You need new revaluations, okay? And devaluations that are not being coordinated or organized, right? So you get two reasons why you're going to have a crisis, right? Then when you have the crisis, the international monetary system disintegrates, as it does right now as we speak. And that disintegration creates conflicts and much less space for countries to figure out their policies, right? When you have international monetary system disintegrating, you get financial and monetary instability. You're also reducing the policy space that countries have, while they're also having more polarized politics. So this is a combination, bad news. We are right now at the beginning of that process. Historically, that process lasts 10, 15, 20 years. It's not going to last that long because we are clearly facing a much more urgent crisis around the corner. I'll get to that. One thing that I'm writing that right now is I'm trying to put together different interesting contributions to the understanding of the international monetary system. Right? So I have Paul Krugman's matrix of world money functions. I have Barry Eichengreen's criteria of what's necessary behind world money. How does your currency become an international traded currency, right? What are the political and socio-economic requirements for that? Deep financial markets, soft power government, etc. Right? Then I have an interesting concept, Sheila Dow's international liquidity preference, which is important because it explains the inert nature of the system. There's typically a global agreement among participants in the international context of a world economy to use just one money. This will change. We're going to use three monies, right, forthwith. But so to me, that's the whole question of the international liquidity preference is very important to understand better, because it's decisive for whether a tripolar system can work or not. Because I think we're moving to a tripolar system. That's the whole idea, multipolar capitalism. I have Davidson's taxonomy. I'm not sure how I feel about this, but this is the question about ultimately important to me because I want to come back to a single currency, a single money for international transactions. And in his taxonomy, I can do that. Or with his taxonomy, I can do that. And then we have De Conti and Daniela Prates, the international monetary pyramid, right? Very important. So these elements can give you a kind of, perhaps a theory of international money. I'm kind of nervous about it because I'm writing about this right now. I'm beginning to write this right now. Right. So, man, I have to speed this up a little. Look, when you look at the statistics, when you look at the 6 world money functions and you try to measure this, some of them are easily measured, some of them are impossible to measure, but you don't see the end of the dollar standard. The dollar is maintaining its world market share. Let's say the dollar has between 40 and 80% in each of these 6 functions. The next one is euro. The euro has actually declining shares after the Eurozone crisis. The renminbi had rising share, but it's going from 0 to 3, and then it's going back from 3 to 1.5 or 2. Right? The renminbi is nowhere in sight in terms of being measured in its like in a standard way of measurement, right? By market shares, right? That already makes it clear to you or me that that's not how you think of world money only, right? Because the renminbi is far more important already than just measurable in those 6 functional market shares, right? But what's interesting about that is how did it go from here to there and then back? What happened to China? Right? But my argument is that you can't just look at those market shares, right, to make predictions about how the international monetary system is going to evolve, right? What you have is the whole question of politics, confidence, vision, the way a country wants to project itself into the rest of the world. And there, Trump is a disturbance, shall we say, right? I have listed here trouble triggers. By the way, the second trouble trigger, US budget deficit and debt ceiling, that got resolved, right? The Senate 2 days ago passed a 2-year deal that's going to take this question away from Trump, right? So the debt ceiling, which was always an incredibly important, very dangerous point in the US, that question has been removed till 2021, and therefore is not a trigger of a dollar crisis anymore until later, right? But you have not discussed at all changes in the way the Fed is now allowed to operate, which will not allow it to be the same kind of lender of last resort and crisis manager in the next crisis. The Fed is hamstrung in ways that it was not. And this is a crucial, to me, this is going to be a crucial problem, okay? Once the world community is realizing that the Fed doesn't have the same powers that it had, there's going to be a total panic about that. You have, worst of all, impossibly deep political paralysis in the US, which is not going to get removed by just throwing Trump out of office. Right? This paralysis was there before Trump. It was even there before Obama. And there are many reasons for this. We can get into details, but it's a very deep one. It basically makes the US a stranded whale on a beach. It can't operate very well. Okay? It doesn't have the wherewithal to manage this process of deglobalization. More importantly, it doesn't have the wherewithal this time around to respond to a crisis decisively. It has weakened its institutions, and it has deepened the paralysis and the divisions. Right? So what you're getting is this kind of gradual, probably accelerating movement towards 3 different zones of influence, each one of them run by a center. And the US is in retreat in that picture. The Europeans have to decide. They have a clear path forward, but they don't have necessarily the political consensus and the political will to do this, right? They're in the middle of a reform, of a post-crisis reform process, and they're stuck with it, right? So they haven't finished their banking reform, even though they have to, banking union, they have one more little step to do, but that little step is really important because it has to do with who carries the burden of banks that they have to restructure. They have hundreds of zombie banks that they need to get rid of, and they don't know how to do that. Then they have capital markets union with, if the euro is ever to be an international currency, you need also financial markets beyond banks. Because world money passes through markets. And they have a problem with establishing European level capital markets, bond markets, stock markets, etc. You have to do further reforms of the European Central Bank, possible now with the nomination of Lagarde. Then you have to have a much bigger European level budget to transfer funds between regions and countries. You need to have a euro bond, which you don't. You only have national sovereign bonds. And then you have those trade deals, right? Which I know the last one that I mentioned is very controversial here and there, Mercosur. Right. Look, China, tomorrow he will tell us, right? But China is a power that is clearly preparing and conducting global reach strategy. So it sees itself as a superpower, and it's willing to act accordingly and to put in place steps to make it grounded as a superpower institutionally. It's an incredibly contradictory process within China, and it's not clear how this plays out, right? Because in order to be fully having a currency that becomes widely traded, which is what a world money currency has to be, you have to also free it. You have to allow it to be more convertible. They're taking little steps, right? And in order to do that, you have to basically remove capital controls. And in order to remove capital controls, you have to reform your banking system. In order to remove your banking system, you're going to have to remove the operation of your state enterprises, as well as how different levels of governments are financed. Because the shadow banking system in China is the intermediation channel between the federal government and local government finance. So you have to go deep into your internal process of reforms that you're not willing and able to do yet, right? So these are incredibly complex questions, how each of these power blocks can project itself functionally into a capable carrier of world money. None of them is there. And because none of them is there, we are in for some trouble, right? The other thing that's interesting to me, and that's part of the strength of regulation theory, is that it emphasizes the varieties of capitalism. And those three blocks represent very different types of capitalism. And you're going to see this in terms of how they're dealing with big data, how they're dealing with 5G technology, how they're going to deal with the question of migrations, how they're going to deal with the diffusion of knowledge in terms of open source with the intellectual property right, with the protection of privacy on data. I mean, it's not just that they are different in terms of their political makeup and their institutional architecture, but they're gonna fight over regulatory approaches, right, on global questions, which should be quite fascinating, right? Oops. Right. So the book ends with scenarios. I'm late, I better run. So the key of this is, of course, I mean, you can have a game theoretical approach, right? You can say, well, you know, I mean, in any case, ménage à trois is always difficult, right? And you can see this already, right? You can see this already. I mean, China playing with Matteo Salvini in Italy. but jokes aside, right? You have to have, either you have the Europeans in between the US and China, because the US and China are going to this trade war, and that's gonna pose some important challenges, right, for Russia as well, and for India as well. But the Europeans are sort of, and for South Africa as well, I would think, right? There's this intermediation role that the Europeans could play. But more importantly, what's the minimum degree of cooperation between those three? Right? And how do you anchor that in a way that's going beyond politicians? You want to have a system of cooperation that goes beyond politicians. That's crucial, right? So one of the things to think about is you have this target zone approach where you stabilize exchange rates, but in order to do so, we had an experiment, the Plaza Agreement of '85 and the Louvre Agreement of '87. How the Louvre Agreement collapsed is an incredibly important lesson of history, because you're going to have macroeconomic policy coordination. In the Louvre Agreement, the G7 countries coordinated in crucial moments both. I mean, they had target zones and they were secret and they adjusted them every 6 months and nobody knew what the target zones were. And the markets were like, let's test this, we don't know. But they would have coordinated interest rate movements, right? But then it didn't work because it was not enough. You have to have a macroeconomic policy mixed coordination where your sectoral balances stay within certain limits of surpluses and deficits, right? And that requires, some smart economists that are not mainstream, I'm sorry to say, that follow the sectoral balance approach of Keynes, and politicians who have a vision that the national interest is also a collective stabilization interest with your adversarial, competitors. Right? We're not sure that that's going to ever happen, but you're going to have very urgently global governance structures, and I list the ones that are important to me, or that I think that are going to be really important for the rest of the world. But the first one is the crucial one. To me, I don't know how to put this, right? But I've traveled the world enough to know that I can no longer ski in those glaciers in the Austrian Alps that I used to ski as a kid, and that I can no longer scuba dive happily in Belize along the Great Barrier Reef there because half of the corals are dead. And I've lived through Hurricane Sandy, late October 2012. Late October hurricanes, very rare. Never in New York, never destroying a place. My subway, I live on Union Square, the L train doesn't work. The R train doesn't work. Okay, this storm destroyed a chunk, right? 2 of the 14 lines of subways in New York, right? But in between, for 5 days, I had no electricity, no water, 4 people on the 24th floor, walking up and down, then walking 1 mile, 20 blocks to get water, coming back. If you live in New York and then you have to go through that, you know there's a problem. So ever since, I know that climate change is the driving engine of this century. And here the US is far behind other countries. With Trump, even more. Trump fired 650 climate scientists in the US and dismantled the 2 institutions that work on it, right? And he punishes anybody who just mentions the word. I also took note that in Brazil, the Brazilian minister thought of climate change as a Marxist joke, right? So, when we run by that, if you run by people like that at this point in life, you're going to have a huge crisis. And then how we deal with that crisis is going to really, really become crucial, right? The final question is, when you have a 3-block configuration, you have a lot of other regional powers. How do they fit into this picture? In other words, talk about it during the BRICS winter school, right? How does South Africa fit into this picture? How does Russia fit into this picture, right? What's left for these countries in terms of policy space and the kind of industrial structure that they need to think about in terms of going forward, and the balance between domestic and external growth drivers, if you have this kind of disintegration and reorganization? That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.